I welcome everyone to the finals of SRT 2017 once again. On the panel, we have Khanna, Srdf Sen, Ariman, Bhavya, Niharika, ABD, Praneeth, Mayank, Soumya, Saloni, Shreya, and Jagrit. Congratulations, and myself. Congratulations to all of us for judging this. On side government, we have Stephens B, that's Nikita, Raghav, and Namrata. Right? And side opposition, we have Praachi and Tejas. On the motion, this house regrets the erosion of epistemic modesty in our everyday lives. I call upon the Prime Minister to begin the case from side government. Here. Who's keeping time? Sorry? Okay. Sit right in front of me.
Mr. Speaker, we begin by talking to you about epistemic immodesty at two levels of operation. We think that this kind of immodesty operates at the level of structural creation of knowledge, with regard to how we create certain systems of knowledge that individuals can then subscribe to, and how we create these systems of knowledge with the idea of an absolute truth or an absolute version of truth. And secondly, we talk to you about the individual conception of this epistemic immodesty, with regard to how the individual perceives their own knowledge, and therefore how the individual goes ahead and engages with other individuals and their conceptions of knowledge. But coming to this first idea of what we think the structures of the erosion of epistemic modesty is, we think that this begins essentially with the identification of a scientific rationality, or the idea that there is the conception of an absolute truth that can be identified through certain scientific methodology, or through science as a discipline, or through scientific conceptions of truth as an absolute. We think that this is a fallacious conception that has infiltrated the ways in which people think of knowledge, because we think that the idea that science leads to an absolute truth, such as, for example, that gravity is something that exists, is also fallacious, because we think that science is paradigm driven and is driven by theories and is driven by fundamental assumptions. We think that the negligence or the negation of the ideas of these assumptions is partly problematic and partly leading to this idea of we think that we know everything with regard to a particular discipline, with regard to a particular conception. We think that this idea of an absolute also derives from the fact that we do not acknowledge the existence of anomalies within the search for truth. We do not exist the ability to see that anomalies could in fact be possibly the very truth that we're looking for. And we think in that conception, the problem that exists is that we trap ourselves into a particular paradigm that we define with regard to methodology that we have already defined. We think, for example, in science, the idea that experimental truth is derived by virtue of certain specific methodologies, and that these truths, if followed with this methodology, will necessarily lead to the creation or the recognition of some absolute truth, is undeniable and is fixed within the discipline. We think that that's problematic, particularly with respect to the idea that when you ignore anomalies within the structure, you ignore the ability of those to be the truth. We think, for example, the idea that the Wall Street crash is not something that could be predicted by the economic discipline was largely to do with the fact that they negated the idea that assumptions or base assumptions within the discipline were counteracting our ability to predict those very conceptions in the first place, or those very acts in the first place. We think the idea that the reason we now think of the housing bubble as an anomaly, as something that is not a structure or a function of the capitalist structure, and is not something that's a failure of the idea of arbitrage in the first place, but is rather an anomaly of arbitrage. We think that that's part of the problem. We think part of the problem goes with the denial that there can be something wrong with the conception of an absolute truth. We think that the reason that it takes so long for new paradigms within these conceptions of knowledge or these disciplines of knowledge to come about are because they trap themselves within these paradigms. We think the idea that the world is flat was prevalent for so long because it took so much to dispel that notion of that being an absolute truth, because there was a derivable form of experimental research that went into creating that very conception in the first place. And we think that that idea of that process becoming inalienable and that process leading to something that is an absolute truth is something that we do not encourage and do not want. But what are the harms of something like this? What are the harms of the conception of knowledge of this nature? We think what happens in status quo is the idea of expertise becomes magnified. The idea of an individual who knows everything because there can be someone who knows everything becomes important and becomes inalienable to people. By then the question then becomes, I believe in something and I have to believe in A or B, but my conception of what I believe is derives from another individual who knows everything about that particular issue, who knows everything about that particular trade-off. And we think in that situation, the question then becomes, who do I listen to? Who do I subscribe to? We think in that question, engagement becomes a zero-sum game because it's either me or them. It's either I'm right or you're right. We think in that idea, the conception of confidence in one's own notion of knowledge or confidence in one's own conception of knowledge or who the expert that I am listening to becomes so inalienable to a person that it becomes difficult to separate the idea of a possibility for engagement. But we also talked to you about the second idea of how in this conception, the most sure individual, the most confident individual also becomes the most right individual. And we think that that's a fallacious equivalent because we don't think that's necessarily true. We also think more importantly that that's something that privileges existing power structures because we think that the ability of an individual to think they're right is all that much more greater when they're privileged within a particular society, when they're privileged within a particular relationship. We think that this conflation of confidence with truth or confidence with abilities to derive some kind of truth is particularly problematic because we think, for example, that the ability to see a black person as a criminal based on your own lived experiences and based on the idea that you now have experts who derive from those lived experiences and tell you that, yeah, you know, black people are more, there are more criminals who are black people than less, right? And we think in that conception, the ability to subscribe to that notion of truth or to subscribe to that notion of truth as an absolute notion of truth becomes easier for me as a white man. It becomes easier for me to believe that than to believe anything else because the minute you acknowledge that there exists some kind of notion of absolute truth, you acknowledge that there is someone who can tell you what that absolute truth is. We think that this ability of the structure to then transfer knowledge to individuals and then for individuals to not question that knowledge is particularly problematic on their side of the house because we think the ability of science or the ability of a pill to go ahead and say this is what it contains and this is what you're eating, but you don't know whether that's good for you or bad for you yet. We think that when the latter is missing, that's problematic. We think the ability of individual structures, individual products, individual systems of knowledge to acknowledge that they may not know something is the first step in allowing for the creation of doubt that leads to the inquiry in the first place. And we think that that is dispelled entirely when you're constantly telling people that we know what we're talking about, listen to us, we are telling you an absolute truth. We think that in the alternative of this, right, we don't think that we're proposing here to suspend any kind of action or to suspend the living of daily life. We think what we're talking about is the acknowledgement that you're working on heuristic facts, is the acknowledgement that you're working on things that can be experimentally wrong, on things that can be anomalies, that your normal can possibly be an anomaly and the anomaly can possibly be the next novel. We think the recognition of that heurism is the first step in acknowledging that there is something better to be derived with regard to systems of knowledge, there is something better to be derived with regard to how I live my individual life. We think in that context, it is important to recognize that the minute you say that erosion of epistemic modesty is somehow a good thing, right? We think in that context, you are acknowledging that you do not want individuals to acknowledge that there may be something missing from their knowledge base. The minute you tell people that they can possibly know everything and everything within a particular context, you're telling them that there is no need for further inquiry in defending that very first premise, in defending that very first assumption. So you're basically telling an economist that yes, you couldn't explain the Wall Street crash, but there's no need to go and explore your base assumptions because there can't possibly be something wrong with your base assumptions. We think that that's a problematic way in which structures of knowledge should develop because we think the structures of knowledge need to develop in ways that are slightly more acknowledging of the fact that they could be wrong or the fact that they could have misunderstood certain elements of reality in the putting out of an absolute truth.
I thank the Prime Minister for that speech. Now from side opposition, I call upon the leader to open the case. Jaya. The Lordship of can you also phone me?
Ladies and gentlemen, we think side government today has mischaracterized what epistemological modesty is, right? Because we tell you that epistemical modesty stands for the idea that you should be unsure and you're underconfident. And this, ladies and gentlemen, stems from the fact that you're a very, very small part of the universe. You will never truly know what's happening around you. Things that are happening around you are way beyond your control, and there are cosmic forces that are acting to determine your life. Your life is determined already, and in that sense, your life is incidental. What you do, your actions as an individual are incidental and tiny and do not change anything in the larger context. We think it also stands for things like you will never reach the truth, not that you can reach different ideas of the truth. So the idea, ladies and gentlemen, is that because when you think that there is no truth that you can ever achieve, we think you never question the system, you never engage. So when they tell you that you will engage more when there is doubt, you will question more when there is doubt, we tell you all of those things don't happen, because it's generally the idea of epistemological modesty in your everyday lives is the idea that you can never truly know what happens around you, and every single thing that you do happens to you through a variety of forces. So we tell you in that context, you're you're not unlikely to question, you're unlikely to be doubtful and try to change the system, because literally every single thing that you do doesn't matter and it's incidental and doesn't really change what's happening on the ground, right? We tell you, ladies and gentlemen, in that particular context, we think that epistemical modesty, especially in your everyday lives, because we think that's not what they have at all spoken to you about in first speech, in your everyday lives, this level of assurance and confidence is in fact a tool of the oppressor to establish and maintain order. We think it's like religion, right? It's like saying that your life is predetermined in the sense that there are lots of forces beyond your control that are acting on you, which is why you should be unsure, you're underconfident, because you can never truly know what is happening in this entire world, and you can never truly do anything that will change your situation. You can never truly transcend your reality, because that reality is beyond your control. We think it's like religion in that sense, that your life is determined by someone else, and in that context, as a tool by the oppressors, it's used for you to tell you that you should just submit to your realities, because there are forces beyond your control. Your life is incidental, and in that sense, you can never truly find truth, right? So, for individuals on an everyday basis, it results in the idea that you should submit to authority. That there's nothing you can do for this life that you are living. You should just go on and continue to live this life. We think all of these ideas were, for instance, used by the church, right, to tell people and poor farmers that your life will continue like this, and ladies and gentlemen, and in that context, you should continue to submit. We think it's used as a sedative in that particular context, where you say that your actions don't matter and there is nothing you can do to change your situation. We think it results in a threefold harm, right? First, ladies and gentlemen, we think it takes away attention from structures, because the idea is that the structures are not in control, right? There is something way beyond it that is in control, and what governs your life is something outside of it, which is why we think that it takes focus away from structures. We think when there is erosion of this idea, when you're more sure, we think the idea that is fed to you is that your reality matters, your agency matters, and in that sense, the structures that govern you matter because they influence your daily life. We think that is the kind of idea that results in more questioning, because it forces you to engage with your system, because your structure is resulting in your reality. Therefore, it's important for you to strengthen or better your structure, engage with that system, and act more. We think the idea also, and second-fold idea, is that, ladies and gentlemen, when you're underconfident, when you think that there is nothing you can do about your life, we think the value of your agency is compromised. We think this is problematic, especially for oppressed classes, ladies and gentlemen, because we think that for instance, a Shudra, we think it's important and their agency matters, because we think what they do matters. So, for instance, for a black man going out to protest, his protest matters, and regardless of what might happen, right? We think that kind of confidence and that instilling of confidence happens with the erosion of epistemological modesty, because the idea with epistemological modesty is that my life is good, there's nothing I can do about my life because it's incidental, and we think in that particular sense, it becomes problematic. We think, in fact, what the erosion of this has led to is the upcoming of movements, right? Like Black Lives Matter, which acknowledge the fact that there is a structure that is problematic, and the only way you can change that structure is if you put yourself in a position where your agency matters. We think that's the kind of rhetoric that allows for a galvanization of forces, allows people to come out and say that my reality is going to be determined by me, therefore I should act. We think in that context, a black man necessarily should go out and should protest because his agency matters. We think, for instance, that Shudra man or that poor person should take up or should aim for ambition, should aim for a life where he can do a lot more than simply limiting himself to this. But we also think, ladies and gentlemen, it curbs and prevents change on another level. We think even do-gooders, right? We think people who have ambition, who think that their agency matters and who want to change the world in their scenario, will not be able to do that simply because, ladies and gentlemen, they'll be told that everything you do for poor people in slum areas do not matter, right? Because we think that when you are confident, when you're sure, in a second, when you're you're sure. We think in that particular context is when you want to do good, you're able to do good because the good that you're doing matters and is influencing lives and is affecting change. We think in the absence of that kind of idea, we think with the erosion of this is when you allow for people to truly value their agency and in that sense attempt to create change.
Ma'am, in an epistemically modest world, I am told that no being knows absolute truth. Why then will I believe the church when it tells me that they know absolute truth?
Ladies and gentlemen, because here's the thing, right? The church tells you that there is God, there is religion, there is something outside that determines your world order. There are cosmic forces that determine your world order. There is nothing else, right? We think in that particular paradigm, when you think that there is nothing you can do to change your life because this is something beyond your control, those cosmic forces are beyond your control. They don't say patriarchy is a problem. They say those cosmic forces are beyond your control. In that sense, you don't really question things that are governing you. So you won't question the church that is actually the reason why you're being oppressed. But in fact, you will see that there are cosmic forces outside of my control that are resulting in my oppression. Therefore, the impetus to change, the impetus to engage with institutions, the impetus to result in inquiry are all things that don't happen on that side of the house. Because we think that it's important for this kind of questioning and doubt to exist, for people to believe that their questioning matters, that their doubt matters, that the things that they're questioning can truly be changed. We think with epistemological modesty in your everyday life, there is a general idea that there are things outside of that your life is incidental and that there are things outside of your control that are governing your life. We think in that context, when you think that there is nothing you can do to change the situation, when there is the idea that your agency doesn't matter because your agency will never truly result in actual change, we think that is when ideas of, for instance, things like class consciousness do not develop because you think that there is nothing you can do. We think in that context, it's important for the primacy on individual agency to be placed because we think it's only then that real change can happen. It's only then that truly questioning can happen to change your systems because that's when you question structures. That's when you want to engage with them because you think they are directly responsible for your life. It's only when you think that they are responsible for your life will you attempt to change them and engage with them.
I thank the leader of opposition for that speech. To continue the case to decide government, I call him on his secretary prime minister. Right.
Madam Speaker, we think there has been a terrible conflation of nihilism with epistemic modesty on side opposition, right? Because the argument isn't that we don't think we are in control of our lives, but the argument of epistemic modesty is we don't know what controls our life. It may be me, it may be cosmic forces, it may be other things. And in that paradigm, we think in a world where you now believe you can definitely know, or at least someone can definitely know what controls you, is a paradigm where power accrues to the oppressor far, far more than in ours, where there is constant scrutiny of whether or not they are in fact telling you the truth about what controls you, right? Because it's in their paradigm that I now create a position such as the church, which is accessible to the absolute truth, which in fact, despite being human, can truly tell me what is real, what controls my life, what kind of knowledge I ought to have. And in status quo, we believe that certain power structures already occupy that position that go beyond questioning, because the argument is simple, right? And this is where the entire argument of how it works on two levels becomes important. I as an individual may not know what controls me, but I know my lived experiences, and my presumption in an epistemically immodest world will be that my lived assumptions are necessarily true. I will also now believe that there exists a person in society who necessarily knows what forces control me and what are true, right? That whether or not a person exists in society who through their experimentation, etc., has acquired enough knowledge to know what essentially is true and whether or not that's the dissemination that happens. And in that situation, it is linked on my ability to then transfer that power or transfer that ability to that expert, where I say, I bequeath all my decision making to you, since I believe that you are the one who knows what is absolutely true. That only happens within a paradigm where epistemic immodesty creates these power situations and creates these roles of people who can access absolute truth. What in contrast is our move, right? Our move is constant doubt, right? Our move is the idea that positions of power like this may know some things which are convenient or heuristic models, but those are always up for question. And if the thing they want to argue here is change, let's talk about how there's faster and more meaningful change in our case. Because how does change take place, right? One, change takes place when someone questions status quo. When does someone question status quo? When they believe that the person saying that may not necessarily know everything that is true. And we tell you that happens only in a model where we believe that no one is capable of knowing what is true. Because the minute you create a situation where a person can claim the mantle of the most knowledgeable, where a person can simply say, I know best, listen to me because of all my credentials, because of all my study, etc., etc., that is a situation in which I am more likely to not question this person, not doubt this person, etc., etc. But more importantly, right, we think change also occurs when there's engagement with the structure in power and those below. And we think that is definitely eroded in their move when that power structure has really no reason or incentive to engage. Because what is that power based on? That power is based on seeming most convinced, right? Because my argument is I have to be the most convinced person. If I am the most true person, I need to be able to sell to people that I am the most convinced person. We tell you that kind of ability to sell yourself, that kind of ability to be so sure about yourself comes from a tremendous amount of privilege where external forces have constantly validated you throughout life, and thus you will continue to believe that you are so sure. It is in that paradigm that I will not go ahead and say engage with the outlier that comes up, but will simply say, no, look at my credentials, look at all the people who support me, you're an idiot. Which is exactly what Noam Chomsky does when he says, I have a universal grammar language or grammar of language, and all languages are recursive. But when the one guy finds out that there is a non-recursive language in the world, he just says, I am MIT Professor Emeritus, you are like some random dude, fuck off. And which is why for 20 years, we have still been living under this false notion that all languages and universal grammars exist. That is a situation that happens in their model. When Alan Greenspan can say things like the boom bust cycle is over, we have entered this world where there is constant equilibrium, and we believe him because we think he has done the research and therefore will know best. We will not believe the guys in the Big Short who went out of their way and pointed out anomalies, because Alan Greenspan will just laugh at them when they enter their boardrooms because they've earned so much more, because they are so much more convinced, because they get so much more airtime, and because it is in their most incentive to seem like this anomaly is not powerful given the position of power they occupy. So it is in their paradigm where we do not acknowledge these anomalies that force us to question our move. But before I move on, your view.
If the erosion of epistemic modesty actually did make you stop questioning religion and did enable you to start questioning these forces, what do you think allowed for the when do you think change is better possible? When you think that this is something that is under your control, or when it isn't?
It's not about whether you control it or not. It's about whether anyone can know what controls you in its entirety or not. In a situation where you believe someone can know who controls it in their entirety or not, that someone will be the church in the 1960s or whatever 1800s, it will be colonial powers in the 1800s, it will be today's like stockbrokers and hedge fund managers. That is the paradigm in which domination happens. We aren't arguing nihilism here where people are like nothing really matters, man. It's about whether or not I know what is dictating my forces. So I will still go out and run even though I don't know whether or not running is actually linked to weight loss, because it is a convenient heuristic. And here's the distinction. We will continue to rely on science, but we will not rely on it to a point where we think it's an absolute science that cannot be like questionable, right? Simply a simple argument is it is convenient for us to believe in this idea because this is the idea that makes most correlative sense in status quo. We do not believe that that is the only idea and we cannot question this, and that is the alternative that we run, and we think that is a far better model on our side, right? So given that their argument is entirely about change, right? We think change is simply going to you are simply going to color all dissent in a situation where the person in power is given that power because of his knowledge of truth as one that is not meaningful, as one that can simply be brushed away, not by dealing with the content of their argument, but simply by dealing with the fact that you already occupy that position and that person does not. Because people don't believe that you actually can question the person who knows the most. You will just think that the people will only change. And here's why you don't have changes in model, because Alan Greenspan got replaced by Ben Bernanke, but the system still stayed. Dodd-Frank came in, but you still have all sorts of risky funds in the same place because no one recognized that the entire assumption that, hey man, maybe you can securitize funds so that there is no risk at all is flawed. All you did was say that no, sometimes it can be flawed, sometimes it cannot be not, maybe mortgage funds weren't enough. So you don't really change the structure, you don't really change the system. You change those in power because epistemic immodesty creates those positions of power. People in positions of power have all the incentive to stay in power, and they stay in power simply by flaunting credentials, simply by flaunting the fact that they know more simply because more people believe them. And that is a situation in which those with privilege constantly rise to the top, quash dissent, quash anomalies, make make you believe that they know best and you ought not to question them very loudly.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. To continue the case from side opposition, I call upon its Deputy Leader. Tejas.
Right, so ladies and gentlemen, three things primarily in this debate that have already come up, which I'm going to be tackling, right? Number one, this idea of what Raghav talked about, right? This idea of you don't know what controls you, and because you don't know it, because of this gray area, because of this uncertainty, you are more likely to question some forces. Number two, I'm going to be talking to you about oppression and the nature of how this oppression works. Because we feel this motion, and especially because it talks about everyday life and the fact that it is a regret motion, they need to tell us not even an ideal scenario about the principles of epistemic modesty. Rather, they need to show us about how epistemic modesty plays out in the current scenario, in a scenario where there are structures, where there are power structures, where there is inequality, etc. And number three, I'm going to be talking about the ability for change to take place, right? But number one, let's begin by where Raghav left off, right? Whereas the idea of, hey, somehow, because I don't know what really controls me, I don't know, like, I'm more likely to question things. I'm more likely to see question the church or any other power structure, simply because of the fact that, look, it is something that they don't know, right? And they don't know the truth itself, right? But here's the problem. We tell you that in the current reality right now, we think that there are forces that do control you. So when you do talk about Alan Greenspan, and when you do talk about the housing bubble, we tell you that we want the poor man to feel that no, it's not that you don't know what controls you, but rather capitalism does control you, and those in privilege do control you. And that is why it is your reason, and it is your purpose, and you have value in it. It is worth changing. We tell you that this gray area, this idea of uncertainty of where control lies, it is what that principle itself is what is used by those in privilege to truly oppress people below, right? To truly hinder the formation of class consciousness, right? How does that work? Because when a rich man says, at the end of the day, nothing is the truth and nothing is right, and no one really is in control over here, what he does is dilutes the importance of his privilege itself, and says that, perhaps my privilege and your fighting against the privilege is wrong and it is illegitimate, because even your truth of hunger and even your truth of oppression is something that is questionable, and it is something that we should question and we should see whether it's legitimate or not. So we tell you that throughout, given the fact that the acknowledge that power structures do exist, the way this modesty is distributed is unequal in such that the privileged have used it as a tool, to delegitimize any sort of fight against oppression, to delegitimize the reality of their own existence and the reality of human consciousness itself. Why? Because they say, hey, privilege itself is just a conscious construct. The reality of privilege, or the questions arising after it, or the right or the wrong of the privilege itself, is something that is up to debate. No, ladies and gentlemen, we don't want that to be up for debate, because we tell you that this control is something which is real, and it is felt in the everyday life of every single person, particularly those who are oppressed. When they feel this oppression, when they feel this control, we don't want them to feel that I don't know where it is coming from, or rather, I don't know, like, oh, they're wrong and even I'm wrong, or even the thought of I perhaps may also be wrong and even I don't know the truth. Because we believe that we want to inculcate a situation where those who are oppressed, we want them to believe in the single truth of their oppression, and we want others and allies to believe that that oppression is something which is true and legitimate, and hence any fight against oppression is legitimate. So we tell you that the idea of questioning happens more on our side very clearly, because you can only question structures when you know that they have an effect on you, right? And we tell you that when you don't know where exactly control lies, rather when you don't really know where exactly your life will be or what your life is dictated by, we tell you that this questioning does not happen, because the motive for the questioning or value of questioning is something that is not found in the oppressed classes. Because I won't see as a Dalit value in questioning my superiors when I know that first of all they give me this random privileged jargon about actually even your oppression is something which is debatable, and the fact that it is something which is something that is beyond your oppression, which is perhaps more important, right? I don't want that. As a Dalit, I simply want people to recognize the fact that my oppression is something that matters, and it matters in a way that it is given primacy over everything else. We don't think they can prove to you that that oppression is something which is given primacy over everything else, given the fact that there isn't a single truth, and because there isn't a single truth, and because there are power structures, this idea of a gray area, the idea of uncertainty becomes about the power, person in power spinning this bullshit to you say that, you know what, at the end of the day, there are things beyond our control. And because they're beyond my control also, I'm not really the one at fault. And that is where it goes. That we tell you that blame is something which needs to be pointed. We tell you that the only way we can fight for change and question, and the only way we can really fight oppression is when you know that the blame lies on the oppressor, when the blame lies on the privileged. We tell you that this type of knowledge, this type of modesty, epistemic of time, is by very nature always in the ivory tower, always disconnected. And because it is always disconnected, it is a tool of the oppressor, the tool of the oppressor to say that there isn't a single truth and that nothing is legitimate. Think about that, right? Because there is no truth, nothing is legitimate. And so even you fighting me is not legitimate. And they say, no, actually people will question. They're not in a position to question in the first place because they are oppressed. We want something that they can fight the oppression completely, right? And we think that'll happen if at least they believe in a single truth. And the world believes in a single truth of, say, freedom or of, say, equality. When that happens, we tell you that questioning takes place, change takes place, and capitalism is also restructured. And there goes your Greenspan example, yeah.
So, what is better for a black person? A world in which a white person does not know whether privilege exists or not, or a world in which a white person is absolutely sure that privilege exists and you cannot break that truth?
We think you're reducing it to a really weird analysis, right? What is better and what is the best for the black person is this, simply this. It's this idea that I am oppressed. I am oppressed by the white. And the idea of then following that, like the idea of questioning and the ability of the black person to truly question the white person arises only when he knows that the white person is the one to blame directly for his oppression. And the white person does not have a cop-out. The cop-out of saying that perhaps there is something which is even beyond oppression that we can't comprehend, right? So we tell you, it's not simply about concentration of truth, because we think the concentration of epistemic modesty also exists. So the contestation of the actual principal meaning of epistemic modesty lies with the privileged class. So we think the black person, in fact, will never be able to truly even understand the nuances of what epistemic knowledge is unless he believes he's already fighting oppression. The act of already fighting oppression will only happen when he knows it is worth fighting for. Now, what does epistemic knowledge mean? It teaches this idea that, look, because we are incidental, because there are things beyond the realm of human consciousness, the realm of human consciousness itself is something that matters less, or it is lower than the greater idea. We tell you that the Dalits and the blacks only survive and live their lives and feel hungry or fight in the realm of human consciousness. So we tell you, in order for them to fight oppression or to actually question those in power, they need to believe in the primacy of the human consciousness and the conscious reality. They can only feel that this reality is something which is important when they know that nothing else above that exists. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you, it is important to focus on the stark realities of human consciousness and what it does, rather than trying to tell you that there are many truths so the black person will question. Because the idea of epistemic knowledge has not been used that way historically, right? It's a regret motion. It's not a principle motion. So it hasn't been used that way. So hence we support the erosion of it. And we are very, very proud to.
Thank you, Deputy Leader, for that speech. For the final substantive speech from the government, I call for a shoot. So,
Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, there are three major themes that have emerged during the course of this debate. Firstly, what does it mean to be epistemically certain? Because we think that there has been a fair lack of characterization on-site opposition by what they mean when they say that people should be convinced of themselves. Because we think that we have given you an idea of conviction that they have simply not rebutted, and how that conviction impacts people, which once again they simply have not rebutted. The second major idea of this debate becomes, what does it mean to doubt? Because once again, we think that they have fairly mischaracterized our move by saying that we are proposing a kind of nihilism, which says that all actions are meaningless because you cannot necessarily know what is the truth, right? And we think that that's a false assumption that they are painting on their side of the house, which is something that we simply have not argued. What we have said is that when you don't know what is necessarily true, and when you're willing to question what is true, you're more likely to accept different versions of truth, and therefore accept meaning from more sources than one, and find meaning in more than one type of thing. And we think that's once again something that they absolutely have not rebutted. And lastly, the idea of what is the alternative that we propose. propose? What is the kind of heroism that we want in society, where you do still act, where you do still sort of make decisions and attach meaning to things, but your meaning that you attach to these things is based on the knowledge that my basic assumptions could at some point be wrong, and therefore is open to question, though you may still attach that meaning, and though you may still operate on the basis of the meaning that you attach to those principles in the first place. So let's talk about this first thing first. The idea of what does it really mean to be epistemically certain? Because they come up and they talk to you about the black man who can never question the oppressor because he can never be certain of the fact that he is oppressed. However, the question that we are asking them is what allows that oppression to happen in the first place? What allows that oppression to happen in the first place is for the white person to say that we think that white people know everything because it is possible for someone to know everything. And we think that all of their arguments about how privileged persons need to accept the idea that black people have different experiences and that black people are oppressed fall flat on their own side of the house, because the very idea is that a white person doesn't experience oppression. He doesn't see racism. Therefore, the idea that I can know everything as a white person means that I can never know racism. Therefore, racism does not exist. And I think that's the link that they fundamentally have not understood on that side of the house, where we come up and tell you that we think that in our paradigm it is possible for the black person to question oppression because the basis of that oppression is something that is open to questioning, because it is not something that is solidified. It is not something that is taken as an absolute truth in the first place. The fact that racism does not exist, the fact that white people are better than black people, the fact that the Christian narrative of what the world is like is the only way in which you can understand the world. And that's why we think that the questioning of oppression and the possibility of change comes on our side of the house, where you say that the reason that the suppression is possible is because you attach absolute truth to the basis on which that oppression operates. We think the moment you take away that narrative, or you say that we regret the idea that you assume this to be the absolute truth in the first place, you regret the idea that that white people have assumed that they have that kind of superiority in the first place, you make it possible for these things to be questioned. And that is where we think that they have simply not understood the idea of how this epistemological certainty works, right? Because we think that they can't say that it is only black people who we are talking about, because we think that privileged people are epistemologically certain in today's day and age as well. And we think, for example, you can also talk about paradigm where right now white people are epistemologically certain that black people don't face racism or that black people are not oppressed. Similarly, we also think, for example, that simply the idea that you are suffering right now doesn't determine that you know everything about why you're suffering, right? Which is why we think the idea that Germans link their own suffering to the fact that Jews are rich and the fact that Jews are doing also all these horrible things, or the fact that white collar workers say, I don't have a job, and the reason for that must be because the person is right. What must be the truth, must be the absolute reality under which we live. And I think that only comes when you don't question basic assumptions, because you assume that your basic assumptions are sound. And that is where we come to the second major idea, the idea of what does it really mean to doubt, right? Because we are not arguing to you a certain kind of realism. We are not arguing to you that nothing is true. We are saying that there exist limits on the amount of knowledge that people can possess, or that there exist certain kinds of limits where you can, beyond a point, not know certain things, right? We think that this is not the same thing as saying that nothing is true or nothing is good. We still think you can, for example, make value judgments about the fact that I don't think it's good for people to feel pain, because you can know that pain exists because you feel it. However, what you cannot now do is say that it is possible for an individual or for a group of individuals to know every single thing that exists in this world, and therefore for their opinion or for their expertise, which is what Nikita's entire speech was about, to become the only narrative that exists in society. Because we think that that's what happens today, where individuals live their daily lives on the basis of assumptions that we think very nearly can be false, right? We think, for example, when scientists tell you, you know what, my methodology is absolutely 100% correct, we think they also fail to tell you the fact that, for example, they're only looking at confirming observed instances and not total instances in totality. And the reason we think that there exists this kind of impulse within the scientific community to only look at confirming instances is because when they look at anomalies challenge their basic assumptions. And when they are so sure of their basic assumptions, they don't treat anomalies as actual new truths, they treat them as anomalies to the rule, because the rule itself can never change, because the rule itself can never be questioned. And that's when we talk to you about the idea of doubt, because we don't think doubt means you have to now say, I don't know if gravity exists, I better keep space boots on all the time. It's convenient for me to operate on the basis of the assumption that something is attaching me to the ground, right? But what I need to be careful of is, am I sure that that is gravity in the way that scientists define it? Maybe 100 years from now, it will be something else. The same way that when you have something like the Copernican revolution, right? Why does it take hundreds of years, even though ancient Greeks were talking about geocentrism? Because you are so caught up within your own paradigm that every instance that challenges that paradigm and every instance of racism that a black person experiences is not enough to convince a white person in the first place that racism exists. against them because that wisdom is not part of their knowledge base, and their knowledge base is all the knowledge that they need because they can know everything. And that's where we come to our alternative, right? Because we think this is another idea where we simply have not engaged. The idea that we are not saying that you need to suddenly believe in nothing, right? But we think that when you believe in something, you need to believe in it with the clear understanding that what you believe in may be wrong. And we think that's something that benefits everyone, right? Because we think that we're not arguing a kind of like sort of scientific way. What we're arguing is not like anti-realism, right? What we're arguing is like human causality, when you still constantly operate on the basis of the assumption that cause and effect exists. Because it makes sense for me to say that if I pour water out of this bottle, water will fall and the paper will be wet. But at the same time, I don't assume that all the basic assumptions I make about water, about this table, about what it means to be wet are necessarily true, only that it is convenient for me to believe it because that's what helps me make my life meaningful. That's what allows me to live my life in a way that matters, right? And I think that is a situation in which you are going to question oppression. You are going to question like sort of authority, right? Because now it becomes about you as an individual trying to determine what you think, where you attach meaning, because anything is possible, because things can be false, because not everyone can know everything. And that is where we talk to you about the alternative, the idea of this humanism, where you're not saying that nothing is true, you're not saying nothing has meaning, but you simply assume meaning based on your individual set, based on your individual positioning. And we are very, very proud to propose.
I thank the government youth for that speech. For the response, I call upon the opposition.
Madam Speaker, there are 4 questions that you have to ask yourself before adjudicating this debate. First one being better, the second one being where does action and the ability to take action and the belief that you can take action happen better. The third one being this idea of entitlement and the fact that entitled and privileged people can dictate what's right or wrong, and where the propensity for this kind of dictating to take place is higher. And the fourth one being what is this led to? Again, given that this is a rewrite motion, what is the erosion of this epistemic modesty in the life of everyday life led to, and what can we see from it in our reality, right? But on the first one, right, so government claims that epistemic modesty instills doubt in an individual with respect to what controls their lives. But we try to analyze that it's beyond that, right? And we try to tell you where this doubt stems from and how it affects your ability to make certain actions. Because we told you that for example, the example of religion, we in fact sentence on their side because we think that religion came up and it claimed to know the forces that you aren't cognizant of, right? And we think that thus, because you could never know, you could never question, and you always assume that religion was right simply because the avenue for religion being wrong and the avenue of you being right when you question religion was not something that existed with the existence of epistemic modesty. So we think that religion is something that can constantly be questioned. Science is something that can also constantly be questioned when you propagate the idea that individuals and human beings can know everything, not do know everything. Because we think that is when you encourage individuals to try and figure out the truth in everything. That's when you try and strive for the objective truth, and that's when truth is something that's maximized. That's when the ability to know what is right or wrong is something that's maximized, right? We think it becomes far easier for you to submit yourself to a certain authority, to submit yourself to a force that claims to be cognizant of these forces. This happens on their side, however, because on our side, when it's eroded, you believe that you can be cognizant of the forces, and you believe that these forces can be multiple and that you can be wrong. Again, it's like government assumes that individuals think that they can never be wrong. Of course, you can be wrong about the kind of forces that you assume, and you can constantly question the kind of forces that have played in. The idea is what can you know, right? And the fact that you can know everything, the fact that you can know what forces affect your life means that you can also do something about it because it is something under your control. And that's what people try to argue. Sure, you haven't been arguing that you're nihilist, but you're saying that this kind of thinking is what leads to nihilistic behavior, where you believe that what you're doing has no meaning because you simply don't know the kind of forces that dictate your life. You simply have no ability to know what forces are playing in your life, and so you simply don't have you don't have the ability to change anything about these realities, change anything about these forces, simply because the reality that you have is different than the reality that you live in, right? And we think that that's when questioning takes place. That's when you can't fight, right? That's when you don't want to fight because you believe and you submit yourself to your reality, saying that this is something that's out of my control because I don't know these forces and I can never know these forces. So there is no point in me trying to strive to know what these forces are, trying to figure out what these forces are so that I can question them, simply because these forces are something that are out of my control, something that I don't agrees to.
So in a situation where white people also follow this epistemic modesty and therefore continue to believe that they are right and will not challenge that privilege, why will any sort of change take place?
On this idea of entitlement and privileged people, right? We think on both sides, white men will always say that oppression doesn't exist. They possess the ability to do this. It is in their interest to do this because it allows for their role in society and for their role in the top of narrative to exist. The idea isn't what the white people will say. The idea is when can the black person question best what this white person is saying, because we think that it is this ability, and when they say that an alternative is a clear understanding of what you believe may be wrong, we think that who is more likely to believe that they're wrong and who's more likely to submit to a larger force. We think it's oppressed people, right? Because they don't possess the ability, they don't possess the education, they don't possess the belief that they can know what's wrong. However, white people in your side also, white people will use this force. However, it is on your side where white people can still propagate the narrative and will be allowed to do so. However, without this ability, without the kind of encouragement that exists, without the kind of incentive system that exists for black people to constantly question the forces and to constantly be cognizant of the fact that it isn't some cosmic force that is oppressing me, it is this white man that is oppressing me, we think this is a far likelier situation where oppression can be dealt with, and this is a far better situation in what side government proposes, because we don't think that oppression can ever be fought in that way on their side, right? But on the idea of action, right, we told you that individuals on their paradigm think that they don't know what forces shape their life, so they don't think and they don't know that what they do matters, right? And again, this is where apathy falls in, and we think that by the erosion of it, and this is the characterization that we give from our first piece, we think that the erosion of it led to the ability of individuals fighting oppression in many ways. We think it led to the proliferation of movements, of workers' movements, of black rights movements, because we think that it's then when individuals said that we do know what forces are oppressing us. It's not that we don't know, and it's not that these forces are out of our grasp and that this is something that we have to live with. They do know what forces are oppressing us, and we can do something about it, which leads to our ability to fight these forces, right? And we think that that's a much better situation on our side. I think we are.
So, if I, as a black person in the 1900s, I'm told by a eugenicist that black people are inherently inferior, why am I going to question that eugenicist if I believe that he is capable of knowing absolute truth and has the support of the majority?
That's what we mean. We're not saying science is our alternative or our end game. Science is a stepping stone, and science has come about because we had the ability to believe that we can govern what forces play into our lives. But however, we think that science is something that can still be questioned. Science is something that is constantly questioned, even by side government and even by individuals. Religion is something that is constantly questioned. This happens because individuals possess the ability and the belief that they can know everything. And so everything can be known, and so everything that is said in the world can also be wrong, and that's something that I can pass a value judgment on as an individual. We think that this is what side government is missed out on in trying to engage with our case, and we think that this is where we support the erosion of this epistemic modesty, because it allows individuals to possess the belief, and it delivered the ability to change and to know what forces are shaping your life to everybody's doorstep. We think, however, in the absence of this erosion, this ability still existed. It's not that individuals didn't claim what forces existed in our life. We think, however, the individuals who hegemonized this were the ones with resources, were the ones with powers, were religions, right? But with the erosion of it, individuals at home started questioning these forces. Individuals at home started saying that no, maybe it isn't religion that is dictating my life. It isn't God that's saying that I should live this life particularly. It is the factory worker that is making me work 16 hours a day. And it is this force that I can question and grapple with. And it is this cognizance that I can deal with, right? This abstraction is not something that individuals can deal with, which is what we're trying to argue. That individuals will lead that the existence of epistemic modesty led to individuals being apathetic, led to individuals not wanting to do anything because they believe that they can't do much to change their lives, because the forces that govern their lives are ones that they are cognizant of, are ones that they can even perceive, are ones that are beyond their conscious review. And we think that it's in that situation when individuals don't want to change anything, don't want to do anything and to change their position, because they think that there is something inherent to that position. It's in our side where individuals possess the ability and belief that there is that I can know everything that is happening, and that there are forces that are oppressing me, and I can do something about these forces, that force this individual to go out and protest and ask for rights, and that force this individual to do many other good things that side opposition argues for. Very, very nice.
I thank the opposition group for their speech. Close the case for their side. I call upon the reply.
Right, so ladies and gentlemen, it's very simple, right? we on side opposition believe that uncertainty is the worst enemy of the oppressed. We believe that uncertainty and the idea of grey lines and the idea of nothing being truth is a tool in the hands of the oppressor. We believe that because of this degree of uncertainty, we have seen historically that the ability to hegemonize this uncertainty and to co-opt it for your benefit has always been done again and again by the rich man, by the white man, and by the oppressed or by the oppressor. Right? We believe that the idea that somehow this epistemic modesty is something that will percolate equally across all spectrums of life, and the fact that it will be distributed equally across all spectrums of life, and the fact that even the white man will be modest is something that is a fallacy. Because although the white man may know about epistemic modesty and may know that he is not correct, it is not in his interest to stop that oppression from taking place. So it is the ability of the white man then to use this degree of uncertainty to then justify the oppression by saying that no one knows the truth, so your oppression is also something that is not perhaps real or is not perhaps the ultimate reality. And that is the problem. We tell you the first step towards questioning is acknowledging the fact that there is something called the reality. That is that I am oppressed, that is that I am hungry, that is that I am exploited. The moment you are certain that, look, this is someone to blame and I need to uprise against this particular structure, the ability to question the oppressor becomes that much more. And if you look at the church, right, think about it, right? The fact that we didn't have science advancements at that time, the fact that we didn't know that the earth was round and that there is in fact universe in the first place because it was all pre-Galileo, the church took this uncertainty, spun it into this religious doctrine, and then used it for oppression. How did we fight this? By Galileo pointing out that, look, the moon is in the earth is in fact round, and the fact that the sun is in the middle of the solar system and not the earth, right? It's the idea that when you do become certain, your ability to then question the oppressor, your ability to question, to say that whatever you've been saying is wrong, because I've got hard facts that this is the truth in the first place, the ability to question in that scenario becomes that much more. We tell you that questioning will only happen when you acknowledge the fact that, look, my reality and my human reality is something that should be a truth that is given primacy over all other truths. When you have multiple truths, we have seen it in the historical past that when you have multiple truths, the ability to determine what is the truth in the first place lies with the oppressive, by the oppressor, right? With the oppressor. We tell you, what do they argue? They simply come up and say, no, even the oppressor will acknowledge that, look, this is not the particular truth, so I allow for questioning. That doesn't happen, right? We tell you, because of the power structures that exist in the current scenario, even the idea of modesty comes across through these power structures. It is percolated through these power structures. So we tell you that when this modesty is attained even by the superior class, their ability to practice this modesty is something that hasn't happened. And that is why we tell you the erosion of it is something that is allowed for questioning to take place. We tell you that they need to regret the fact that the erosion of it allows for greater questioning or anything else. We tell you that for so long, when this has existed in the first place, we haven't seen oppressed classes fight up. We haven't seen idea of equality. We haven't seen the oppressed really fighting up. We tell you it is only at this erosion, it is only when it is eroded, it is only when you know the truth, and the truth that equality is something that are prioritized over all other so-called truths, even though I may be wrong in the first place, only then can you be certain. And it is certainty and protest that are interlinked. We tell you that as soon as there is uncertainty on any particular ground, we tell you the ability of power structures to come into place, the ability of those in power to use that uncertainty to fight any sort of retaliation or to dilute the privilege, and the importance of the privilege is great. So we tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that at least the belief that there is a certain truth and that the truth is something that I personally can find, we tell you it is only that belief that really spurs those who are being oppressed and really spurs the black man, because he believes that, look, at the end of the day, no matter what you disagree or you agree on, the idea that oppression is something which is true, and the idea that this truth needs to be superior to all other truths is something that he needs to justify. And that's what happens. That's what happens with the erosion of epistemic modesty. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, we are very, very proud to be.
Thanks, side opposition, for that case. To close the case, inside government, I call upon the reply speaker.
Madam Speaker, what is the main question you want to judge this debate on, right? Where is change better served? Side opposition seems to believe that change is better served when the oppressed is absolutely certain about his oppression. Except they don't deal with our argument of how this certainty creeps in the first place. They seem to believe it's only an individualistic level where I'll just believe things because I believe things. We gave you an argument on how, in our model, it is experts who are determining what is right, and you simply determine who the best expert is and go to them. given that experts are going to be people who are in positions of privilege because you acquire that expertship because of your conviction, you are never going to have a paradigm where this black person will even get to know about the fact of his oppression, because that eugenicist will just tell him, listen man, you are born this way, you're meant to be this way, and that is what the black man will believe, because the black man believes in a nature of epistemology where he thinks that someone can know what is absolutely true. And when everyone is telling him, this man knows what is absolutely true, that is the paradigm in which he simply passes over this thing. And moreover, their case isn't just to support erosion of epistemic modesty in black people, because this is the same kind of paradigm that the Germans had about the Jews in Weimar Germany. This is the same paradigm that now white people will have about black people, where they just think, no, we don't have to engage with them, right? Because the idea is, what if your conviction is false, right? And this is not something they are engaged with at all. What if the German, who literally thinks that that Jew is the reason my country is in shambles, goes out and kills the Jew, is also a paradigm they have to defend, given that they just want action for the sake of action. But on a secondary level, if you want change, when can change happen, right? We think it will become a numbers game when both sides are just going to refuse to engage, because that's what the paradigm they want. They simply believe that the oppressor will never come out and engage with you because he has material interest to protect. However, when is he more likely to engage with you? When he has a theoretical and material basis in their paradigm, or in our paradigm where he may have a material basis, but at least he knows that he is not constantly true about the idea that his privilege is non-existent. That is the place in which propensity for engagement for a possible oppressor to now come and fight alongside your movement is far, far more. In their paradigm, this white man has no reason to believe his truth is not true. This white man is constantly told by people in power that his privilege is something that is legitimate. He, by virtue of his numbers, by virtue of his strength, is just not going to engage with black people. So however much black people fight, what will they really achieve? And that is the case that side government has not dealt with. But on a more fundamental level, right, we also spoke about the kind of change we want. Because we said, what if your assumptions are flawed, right? So for instance, Marxists believe that when you dealt with issues of class, racism and sexism will simply go away, right? And if you don't question those assumptions, if you keep fighting, no, we need to stop looking at racism and sexism, the anomalies that exist of racist people who are like racism, despite there being class, are just anomalies and we don't have to deal with them, are where change is not sustainable and change is not meaningful, because you are constantly going to find ways when you are in that position and have to defend yourself in that position to justify that your initial assumptions were true, to justify it yourself that it was legitimate for you to be in that position and for you to have that power. In that paradigm, change is far, far slower. So if their argument is, no, black people at least now are fighting, the argument is the reason there was so much time in the middle was because there was scientific racism that kept propagating the idea that these people are genetically deeply disposed to not be so true, and people just blindly believed it. And when there was opposing narratives, they just squashed those down because it made it meaningful. This is a paradigm argument. They cannot say it is better for just that black person to believe it is true, because the minute that black person believes he is necessarily true, the white man necessarily believes he is true. The German necessarily believes he is true. The person in positions of power necessarily believes he is true, and that is what they have to defend. If their only burden in this debate was to show that black people need to necessarily be convinced, they might win this debate. But the problem here is it is about the paradigm that we live in. We think a paradigm where there is questioning, where there is a heuristic and not nihilism, where you believe, yeah, maybe I am suffering and I'm going to fight against my suffering because I'm feeling pain, but I don't necessarily think that all my racism stems just from class. It may also stem from other things, is the paradigm we are arguing on. Ours is the argument where there is going to be engagement, where you cannot just squash this side by saying, I am more meaningful, I have more credit. Very proud.
Yes. Judges, in your decision, mention government or opposition, we will vote in terms of seasons, so we don't want to
Yeah, just